Santa Cruz. I now work at what's called New Beginnings. That is a department within the Immigrant Law Center that specifically works with people who have been victims of crime or other abusive or neglect situations in children specifically. Uh, in terms of personal life, I am a mother, as I mentioned. I'm a foster mother. I am a pet owner. As I mentioned, my son just turned 18. I have another adopted child, and then I have a foster child currently who just turned a year in October. So I'm a busy gal. I like it that way most of the time. I am an artist. I have a ceramic studio in my basement, which I started during COVID, and I also make jewelry. And I also just like building and gardening. I just enjoy the challenge of creation, just creating pretty things. So that's what I do when I'm not in the midst of USCIS applications. A little bit more about our organization, our clients. These are the people that we help and that we work with. We offer we help clients get lawful permanent residency for refugees, asylees, um, UNT visa holders, VAWA applicants, and I'll get into what those all mean a little bit later. We help people with naturalization, which is the term for when you are able to become a citizen of this country. I started my volunteer work with the Immigrant Law Center by working with DACA recipients, which is, I'm sure you've heard in the news, it's the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It's a fantastic program. I love it. I wish there was more to be done with that. It's been under attack in the past couple periods in the last 10 years, which I'd be happy to get into if people are interested. We also work with people to get temporary protected status, humanitarian parole, non-immigrant status, all these. I'll go into a little bit more about what they mean because I feel like they don't really have a lot of context, I think, unless you work with folks or have a legal background in immigration. And then lastly, we have another organization, or I'm sorry, another department within our org that I don't get to be part of that maybe I will someday, and that's the deportation and removal defense. That's the litigators in the courtroom, which I think sounds kind of fun, but I'm just not doing that currently. I'm working with people just on an individual level, which is also super rewarding. And then these are just some numbers that kind of give a little brief taste of what we do in the org. I wanted to add that 78% of us are female identifying staff, which I think is pretty cool. Lots of women in the office and lots of female advocates, which I love. That's the number of cases we handled last year, 2,719. We serve 87 counties, which are all the counties in Minnesota. We also serve North Dakota as well. We opened up a branch over there. And our clients are made up of folks from 104 different countries. So it's a very interesting and exciting job. And I get to meet people from all over the world. And I do really love that. And it's a good attempt to practice languages that I don't use very often. So that's a fun little tidbit, side part as well. So now I'm going to go into the background of immigration law and kind of what big decisions informed the current landscape and how the laws and the entire system effectively function. Also, please feel free to interrupt if I'm talking too fast. I've been told I talk too fast, and this is me trying really hard to go slow. So if it's still too fast, you need to tell me to go even slower. So, Deborah?
Oh, I was just going to say we have one question if you want to answer it
Sure.
now or later. For those currently under illegal detention, if they are allowed only one phone call, do you suggest they call MONARCA, the ILCM, the National Immigration Law Center, or other to get in touch with immigration lawyers?
So if an individual is detained and they have one phone call, I believe because in this community, in the immigrant law community, we are all very well connected and we have partnerships with everyone. We try to kind of silo what services we offer so we don't overlap and so we can support one another. So there if a person were to call one of those organizations and they couldn't help, they would get in touch with another organization to see if they could help. So it would create kind of like a phone tree essentially to get them to the right place, hopefully. It doesn't always guarantee that there is any relief that can be offered because of capacity, as you can imagine, especially the defense team. I have capacity to take on more clients, and I'll get to that a little bit later as to why my caseload is a little bit lighter versus the defense team, who've been overrun with more detentions, more cases because of more detentions. So I think that if a person were to call any of those numbers, they would get help eventually. That's a good question. I think it also would depend if the individual has children, because if or has already established representation. Sometimes they have had representation, if not for that specific detention or issue, for other reasons, for a previous application or for a divorce, or like all kinds of different reasons. They might have representation where they could call that attorney and then they could call a different attorney if necessary. But I think just trying to put myself in the shoes of someone where that happens to, I think it would depend also if you have minors that depend on you, because for me, my first call would be to the caregiver or wherever the children are to make sure that they go somewhere that I trust, because as you can imagine, if a parent is detained and minor children are unaccompanied and no one is set to be a person to care for them, then that could create them to go into that could put them into foster care, and then that could be very difficult to get out and to stop that process. So I think I would probably, if I had children, I would want to make sure I had the primary caregiver that I wanted to leave my kids with, because you don't know how long they're going to be detained. And then and then if you give that person the number or encourage them to call one of us, and we will try to do what we can. But if you don't have minor dependents, then I would just call, yeah, a lawyer directly. That was
Thank
the
you.
long answers. Of
Yeah.
course, sorry. Every time you ask a legal question, it's always going to be a complicated answer. So apologies in advance. So the key legal decisions in the US that have shaped the way immigration law is implemented and affects people are these acts here. I always start, other folks might not start with this, but I always start with the Indian Appropriations Act, because it is it's an interesting act, and I think it is considered as the first immigration law before these other ones, because well, I'll tell you. Colonizers were unable to expel the indigenous people to a foreign land because obviously they were indigenous, and so because they didn't have that mechanism, this act created the existence of the reservations to which indigenous people were restricted and confined. And so it was the first kind of law in the new United States where it was creating a boundary around a certain people, and a geographical boundary out of which they could not travel, and into which they could not travel. So it created like this zone of boundary that was kind of like the basis for future immigration law. And they did this, as I'm sure everybody knows, is to pave the way for the colonizers' expansion and for the erasure and genocide of the people, as well as the stealing of all the lands that used to be freely used and shared between the indigenous populations. So that, I'd say, is the first piece of legislation that really kind of set the tone for immigration law in the country. The second act would be in 1882, and this was in response to the influx of Chinese Pacific laborers as for the workforce for the railroad expansion and creation. So there was a large population of Chinese immigrants, and the whites didn't like that, and so they created and passed this act that was the first law to prevent an ethnic group from being able to immigrate and naturalize. It set the tone for future acts that were nationality specific, but this was the first and only immigration law to outlaw a specific race, a specific person, to legalize a person. And so this initially barred Chinese, like US born children to Chinese immigrants from gaining naturalization. That was included in this initial bill. However, a couple years after it was passed, there was a case in the Supreme Court called US v. Wong Kim Ark, which was a child born to Chinese immigrants petitioned for to petition to be protected and to obtain a natural birthright upon being born in the U.S., which was successful, thank goodness. And that was the basis, and that was the basis for which the birthright citizenship was interpreted. That was the 14th Amendment, and essentially what the Supreme Court decided was that the language subject to the jurisdiction thereof is equivalent to citizenship. So anyone born in the U.S. is automatically a citizen. So that is where we got our birthright citizenship. Is that the reaction to this act, and it was the law that was created after the decision. The third big kind of grouping of laws were the Immigration and Nationality Act and its amendments during 1950 to 65 around those parts. All of our current immigration law is cited to this. This is the initial kind of big bulk of what structures our immigration law. And it removed the racial barriers from that and overturned the Chinese Exclusion Act, that piece of it. However, it did maintain the quotas of nationalities, which is what we see today, which is still a racially charged policy. And so essentially it limits numbers, it limited numbers of immigrants that could come from certain countries. And as you can imagine, which ones those were and which ones didn't have as many limitations, you can hypothesize that on your own, I'd imagine. And it did establish the basis for all of our current law, as I mentioned. In 1986, we had the Immigration Reform and Control Act, and one of the big parts of this act was that it made it unlawful for employers to knowingly hire unauthorized workers. That had a big effect on immigrants because, as you can imagine, the ability to have financial independence is incredibly important for anything going forward in any way, immigration or just life. And so it disincentivized significantly employers to hire immigrant workers because it penalized and criminalized the employer to hire these folks knowingly. It also had a few good things that it provided a pathway to apply for legal status for limited populations. So it provided opportunities that were brief or very specific for folks where there were none before. And it also increased the funding and enforcement for agencies like the border and the like ICE, for example, ICE, the immigrant, the like border patrol along the border itself, and then the ICE and the rest of the ICE and the rest of the country. And then lastly, a big piece of key legislation that affects us today is the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act that was in the 90s. This further increased the funding at the border. It also increased the technology used, which means they began collecting fingerprints and increasing the amount of the walls and fencing at the border. It also established criminal penalties for misdemeanors and felonies and made those deportable for certain situations. And it criminalized false claims to citizenship. So those are things that can affect your immigration negatively in the future, and that was established with this act. Lastly, it created expedited removal, which is essentially an immediate deportation without a hearing, and it created stricter procedures for permanent residency requirements. An example of that is in order to become a permanent resident, you need to if you entered the U.S. without prior authorization, like if you crossed the border without permission, you need to go back to your home country and obtain a visa and re-enter lawfully in order to get your long-term residency status. However, this act introduced a law that if you do that, then you will be barred from re-entering. So essentially it tells you you have to do this. Oh, you did this and now you're in trouble. So it kind of created this damned if you do, damned if you don't situation for many people who entered illegally. And so it just made everything much more complicated to follow the rules and to exist and to immigrate legally and yeah, it made it more difficult to follow the rules. So that was a lot of information. Those are the key points of these large pieces of legislation. I can pause for questions, but if we're good, then I can continue. I know that was a lot.
Please continue.
I think these are the two weightiest slides. So after this, it will be a little bit more digestible. This is a lot of heavy information. Sorry, 1 minute. Okay, got it. I like to go over these key terms because I feel like we hear them a lot, but we might not know exactly what they mean. I'm going to start at the bottom corner because I feel like that is the least amount of protection. So it kind of like starts here and then goes up. So an undocumented individual is just a person who's been present in the US who either has no status because they overstayed a potential, a prior recognized status or they came in with no permission initially. These folks do not have any available pathways to adjust, and they just simply must exist without any opportunities to change their status because none are provided to them for all the reasons that I just kind of discussed in the structural basis of the acts that created our current immigration system. In the middle bottom, we have deferred action, which you may have heard with DACA. This also is given to certain individuals who I work with that are recipients of U visas or further cement their status so they can work, which is a big part of it. They are allowed the legal ability to work, and they are deprioritized for deportation. So it doesn't mean that they're completely free from deportability. It means that they're low priority and that usually judges will only exercise the right to deport if they've demonstrated some particular reason, like maybe a strong criminal background. We see that changing currently, and we can talk about that later in current implications of immigration law. All the way on the left on the bottom is the temporary forms of immigration. This is as it sounds, is a temporary form of status. For example, a U visa, I'm sorry, a student visa or a tourist visa. Also temporary permanent status, or temporary protective status and parole. These are statuses where you have no pathways to adjust to a more permanent, lawful permanent status or citizenship, but you are legally allowed to be here, and so you are completely protected from deportation, and you have a legal status imbued to you by the government. So it's this kind of like a temporary limbo, but it is a protection. On the top right, we have adjustable categories, and these are categories where while the process is pending, you have some lacks of safeguard, but at the end, it is en route to adjusting to become a lawful permanent status, a permanent resident, which is in the middle top here. And this is when you hear you have a green card, that's what this is. Most of these come through family petitions, which is if one person's U.S. citizen, they can apply for their families. That takes a very long time, and it's sometimes quite complicated to do, but it is the majority of how people obtain these. And then the rest is through employment, and then rarely through refugee applications. And then finally, the initial category is citizenship, which you either get from being born here or you naturalize through a process. After, if you fit into one of these other categories, you can kind of move through the system and eventually go there after completing a large, many different qualifications and making sure you remain completely law-abiding. So those are those statuses. And if there's no questions about them specifically, we can move forward.
There was, Karina, there was one question about your laws and you talked about, was there a major immigration law in 1924?
There were many other immigration laws speckled throughout these for sure. I just wanted to, that slide was already so heavy. I didn't want to just bore the heck out of you all. So I just kind of did the biggest ones that had the most far-reaching implications. I remember several from the 20s specifically, and I think between the 20s and the 30s, no, the 20s and the 50s, I believe there was one law that is particularly salient to me called the wetback law, which severely lowered the Mexican immigration, and it was a response to Mexican workers coming into what was our country, but is now the U.S. So I mean, yes, there are many laws that are salient and important that I couldn't get to here. But if the person has a specific question about a particular law, I'd be interested to hear it if they want. No pressure.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so with all of that kind of background and foundation, we can go into how these laws and policies are applied and how the system functions. These are the three sources of immigration law and policy. At the top are laws, which is all the historical examples that I just went over in the past slide. That's just when Congress passes an act, it becomes law. An example of this is what's called LRIFA. I worked with these folks about 5 years ago. It was in 2020. It's the the Liberian Refugee Fairness Act of 2019-2020. It's in response to a civil war that they were experiencing, and it created a very brief, very temporary pathway to permanent residency, which is normally not available. So laws can be created for a variety of reasons, sometimes to limit and sometimes to create really unique opportunities as a result of someone who has very impressive lobbying skills, because it's quite difficult to create a pathway for permanent residency and citizenship for people out of thin air. And that's what LRIFA did. So that's one way to get a law or a policy. Others are executive agency decisions, and this can come in a variety of ways. The examples I have here are recently in the beginning of October, the agency created a cap on asylum seekers for the year. It reduced the available asylum applications that they will process to 7,500. That was from the initial year during the Biden administration of 125,000. So if you can imagine the difference in those two processing, essentially that was just an agency decision, and they issued a notice, and they had the legal right to do that, to just say, we've decided instead of processing 125,000 applications of asylum seekers, we're going to only do 7,500. And it also should be noted in the specific example, that notice included a specific prioritization of South Africans, which are one of the only white populations who are being allowed asylum due to discrimination purposes. I think that's salient in terms of what the administration prioritizes and focuses on. Another example of an executive agency action is on, I'm sure you guys heard about this in January of this year, Executive Order 14160. That was an attack on birthright citizenship. Essentially, that attempted to upend constitutional protection of what we mentioned, and that was enshrined with the Wong Kim Ark law that I mentioned in the last slide, that if you're born here, you're a citizen. So it was blatantly unconstitutional. It's still winding its way through courts, but that's one way that a law can attempt to be implemented, is that type of agency action in an executive order. And lastly, court decisions, much like the Wong Kim Ark that I mentioned. Even though there can be a law, for example, or an agency action that is implemented, if it's unconstitutional, it'll go through the courts, and that could be, its meaning can be shifted or revoked. And that's how immigration law and policy is shaped in that capacity. So two examples here is a recent court case called Matter of Yauri Hurtado. And this is a particularly interesting case that came through essentially the BIA, which is the immigration law court entity, stripped its judges of the authority to offer bond. So a bond is the right to leave detention while your case winds through the judicial process. Before this case, if an individual that was detained had no disqualifying criminal record or wasn't a flight risk, so if they didn't if they didn't pose a danger to the community, the immigration judge had the discretion to grant bond to that person to allow them to be free while the case works its way through. Cases take a long time to work through the courts, as you might imagine. But since this decision today, anyone who initially entered the U.S. without authorization or permission cannot be offered bond. So once they're detained, they must sit in detention until the process is finished. And that, as you can imagine, encompasses the broad majority of the people who are in this country. Many entered without authorization. So there's, and then a second example of court decisions is Nome v. Vasquez Perdomo, and that was also in the news a lot. That was in September of this year, and that was a Supreme Court decision that essentially allowed discriminatory practices in terms of stopping and questioning of status, and it now protects, or it legalized, I guess, discrimination in such that officials may now stop an individual because of their race, the language they're speaking, or the location of their workplace. That can be a deciding factor in their decision to stop someone. Before one would be protected from that, you can't use discriminatory factors to target people. This decision removed those protections. So now an official can stop someone because they look a certain way or speak in a certain language or are working at a certain place, which justifies a lot of workplace raids that happen in the immigration community. Moving on, unless there's any questions about those.
No questions?
Okay, thank you. These are some examples of the application of our laws in action. So down at the scale, that is an example of the U visa applications. So in 2000, Congress passed a law called the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act. This was to create an opportunity for people who are victims of crime to find permanent status and to secure their presence in the U.S. It also was an attempt to repair the relationship between law enforcement agencies and immigrant populations because people were seeing that immigrants would be afraid to approach law enforcement in the event of being victimized or witnessing crimes, which, as you can imagine, really was was bad for public safety and bad for any type of investigation into a crime. If you go to an immigrant neighborhood and no one wants to talk to you because they're afraid of repercussions, then you can't solve the crime. But this was creating a pathway for people to be cooperative with police and to be provided the protections that they wouldn't be deported as a result of that. The one thing I want to mention about this is that when Congress passed this, they put a cap of 50,000 per year that they could process of these applications, and that was a stagnant amount. So as you can imagine, as the if you have more applications than that every year, the list is going to grow, which makes the processing time grow exponentially. So initially, while these applications, when the act was first passed, it would maybe take 2 to 3 years to process to approve or deny this application. Whereas today, when I process a client who is seeking a U visa, I need to tell them that it could be 20 years before before their application is processed, because if there's a cap, you simply can't go beyond that because it's statutorily restricted. So it's an interesting way how laws can be applied, and it highlights the challenge when politicians are writing laws, not lawyers, because then you get things like this, and it can create this tension. Another example of a congressional immigration policy that was created was parole. This was included in one of the important acts that I mentioned before, the Immigration and Nationality Act, and this creates a temporary safe harbor for people who are experiencing um, difficult situations, and that is cohesive with the U.S. policy and not like a global policy to help these folks. And so the example here is Ukraine. We have a program called U for You, where Ukrainian immigrants are offered temporary parole. It's not a pathway to permanency. It's just a temporary status where you can be protected and because you need to flee a dangerous situation. However, the Homeland Security has discretion whether or not to continue or to uphold these programs. And this is an example of something that changes administration to administration, because once the new administration took control, they have attempted to end all of these parole programs immediately, but these are all being challenged in court. And these are the ways that the law can be applied and how it can really shift between the different sources of law, and how it kind of bends and fights, and then eventually we get the outcome about how it's actually implemented. Any questions on those two programs?
We do have a question, and you may cover this later. What can we do to help immigrants if the courts won't?
Well, what a great question. Thank you. That's lovely. Um, I think that you are doing it already. You're getting interested and curious about the process. I think that when you come into communication with people who are anti-immigrant or xenophobic or have maybe really outdated ideas about what immigration looks like. So I think that, granted, what I've talked about so far has been really dense, and hopefully you can get little pieces of it that kind of resonate with you and you remember. And I think this is really important information just to pass along, because I think people have this idea that immigration is or undocumented immigrants or illegal immigration is due to laziness or criminality just something along those lines, when in reality, it's because we have created a situation where it makes it impossible for people to to enter this country or stay here legally or even seek asylum. And I'll get to it a little bit more in the next couple slides, and that's where I'd love to have more of a discussion. But essentially, what can you do to help immigrants? I mean, my gosh, just talk about it. Try to destigmatize the idea of undocumented immigrants and immigration, period, and just have patience and be interested. And I mean, of course, you can always donate to organizations such as myself, but I mean, I don't, go out into the community and like get to know people that look different, that speak different languages, and just, humanize yourself, humanize others. I think any of those things would be a lovely way to to bridge that gap. Thank you for that question.
We have one more question. How difficult is it for a parolee to achieve refugee status?
So those are two different kind of like categories. And that's kind of the challenge with these statuses like parole is that it doesn't, when I say it doesn't give you a pathway, it doesn't give you like, it means it doesn't give you any like, it's not a stepping stone. That is the final thing. Usually the Liberian Refugee Act that I mentioned earlier, that was a nice little glimpse where Congress was like, you know what, let's give these folks an opportunity to get to the next step because they need it. Again, it was the result of some incredible lobbyists that really loved Liberia. Good for them. I wish we had someone for every single country, but essentially parole and refugee, it's not one to the next. It's kind of one or the other. And currently, this administration isn't accepting refugee applications. So I mean, in effect, refugee status doesn't exist right now. And I was going to kind of get to that in one of the next slides. But parole is just something you can have until the administration decides to just stop it, which they can do at any point, but it will be challenged in the court. Another interesting parole uh, kind of program that I always found particularly just like wild is Afghanistan. That during the Afghanistan war after 9/11 and in Iraq, parole was offered to specific Afghani peoples, specifically those that offered translation services to the U.S. forces, which was a huge, I mean, hugely endangered their lives in the Taliban over there, and so they were offered parole here. The administration is trying to end that or has ended that. And that means your parole is over. It's safe for you to go home. Go home. So these people need to go back to the Taliban controlled country that they remember that they helped us 20 years ago. And there is no mechanism for them to stay. There is no refugee status applications being accepted right now. And they can overstay their parole, in which they will be, in violation. And as you guys see on the news, the the detention rates are really high, the deportation rates are really high, and then the Supreme Court's just said you can stop people based on the way they look. So I mean, if an Afghani person, I imagine, looks Afghani, and so they can just be stopped and detained and then deported, and there's really no recourse for them in a lot of ways. But it's very frustrating. Any other questions before I move on?
Well, there was one, and you maybe answered this with your just now. Is the terminology parole being weaponized by this administration with the public to justify their actions today, where they call all immigrants as criminals? Public wouldn't understand this use of the term parole.
Oh, I see what you're saying. That's an interesting distinction. I think that this administration is weaponizing. I'm trying to be neutral, but I'm really bad at it. I think that this administration is weaponizing anything they can in terms of immigration. I think it is the basis of what was campaigned upon, um, and it is still, and it's just escalating. It's still an escalation. But parole specifically, that was created in the 50s. That terminology. I'm not sure. I can't speak to whether or not it was intentionally chosen because of the relationship it has with parole after being released from jail or incarceration. It's an interesting distinction that I actually never put together because they're so separate in my mind. But yeah, I mean, you could be right. I wouldn't be shocked. It just never clicked in my mind until you mention it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. No more questions.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so happy there's questions. Thank you for being involved and being curious. Current implications, and I will try to go through these lightly. I keep promising you guys a little bit less depth and I can't help myself. So I'll try to be a little bit more informative and just more digestible, but I guess no promises because I've been failing so far. Just a little bit of this is just the casework that I do to give you an example of how how the current implications are kind of washing out in real time. So I work with two groups mostly, U visa applicants and SIJS. U visas are for victims of crime. What it means is you are here without permission, you don't have status, and it's a mechanism for you to get status eventually. It's amazing because you can go from no status to deferred action with the ability to work legally, to permanent residency, and then to naturalization. It's very exciting. There's not a lot of ways to get all those steps. Of course, this is the one that I mentioned that has the cap, which means that current applications, I think today we are processing applications from April 2017. That's an example of how long. So the people that applied then, I'm just now getting processing notifications from USCIS about. My clients that I take today, as I mentioned, I have to warn them that they're not going to get their workers permit for probably about 5 years. They're not going to actually be decided. Their application is not going to be decided upon for probably 20, maybe more. It's a great opportunity for folks. It's just difficult to have those conversations because you want to help someone right now. Another frustrating point that the way things are being, just the current implications of everything in this particular visa program is that um, they, how can I say, nor before, before this year, last administration, they were doing this, they were trying to speed this process along. They can't statutorily change the actual processing cap, but they could change when you got your ability to work. And so they had a faster processing, a faster process for that. So people got their work permits right away, which was an incredible thing to see people be able to legally work. It's a very frightening situation to be in. It makes it impossible to move anywhere, to move up in, just in any capacity and to support your family. And so that was very exciting. That ended this year. That's been frustrating, but it's still a good opportunity for people who've been victims of crime to just try to find some safety and some support and just to get out of their situation. Imagine being an undocumented immigrant in a dangerous situation where you mistrust the police is a frightening place to be in. The second group that I work with a lot is special people who are eligible for special immigrant juvenile status. That is when you are a minor and you are the victim of abuse, neglect, or abandonment. You can petition the court to have a finding of one of those things, and then you can apply to the USCIS that for a special status that you're allowed to work and you're given protection from deportation, and you can eventually become a lawful permanent resident and naturalize. Again, very exciting that that opportunity exists. The current implications, for example, of this is that initially this application was free, which makes sense, being a child that is neglected or abandoned or abused, and this administration changed that and now implemented a fee for this for this application. It also it also used to give you protection from deportation, like I mentioned, deferred action, like DACA, for these children who are these victims once the application's received. That's been taken away. The administration doesn't want that for some reason. So these children are no longer protected from deportation while they have a pending application that they are eligible for, and they're not allowed to work or have identification, and they have to pay for the process. So that's an example of how these things are happening today. I'm gonna keep going, I think, for the next couple slides. There's only a few, and then we can do questions just to kind of go over them real quick. In the news today, you may have heard about some due process issues. Due process is the concept that every individual's presidents in the U.S. have the right to fair treatment and legal recourse when life, liberty, or property is threatened. This is enshrined in our Constitution for all persons, not citizens, in both the Fifth and the 14th Amendment. There are plenty of examples of due process violations currently being detained and arrested without information, without reason, without identification of the person detaining you, inability to to make contact with your family or your lawyer once you've been detained. being detained, even though you have a legal status for not being detained, such as DACA, or being a U visa applicant, or being a long-term permanent resident. We have examples in the news of all these people being detained despite their statuses, and that's a violation of their due process. That is illegal, still happening. And then moving on to go more about detention, to discuss detention a little bit more, the current administration is very aggressive. There has been a lot of funding and a lot of specific attention to detention and to getting to taking people, and specifically going into immigrant communities, and which is, as you can imagine, horribly traumatic and frightening and confusing. Especially when, as you've seen from my previous slides, there's not a lot of mechanisms to immigrate legally or to obtain legal status. So it just feels like a very rigged system, I think. And then also just the human rights violations that are going along with this increased attention and the way it's implemented, the lack of, like I mentioned, the lack of identifying yourself, and then um, just the blatant violations of of warrant requirements, and identifying yourself and releasing people in a timely manner, or being allowed to have bond once you're detained. All these things are legally questionable and extremely problematic and concerning. And then the deportation, it affects families horribly. It rips them apart. It separates them. It uses them to coerce people to self-deport, which is a really terrible thing. You'll see is U.S. citizen children with a undocumented parent, and if the parent is detained, they're threatened with deportation, and they, use their kids as a motivating factor as what's going to happen to your kids if you don't self-deport. So they often feel like that's the only choice. So U.S. citizens are being taken to other countries when they don't want to be, because the parent is threatened with separation. And then kind of mentioning something we talked about earlier, the refugee and asylum program. I mean, does America really offer sanctuary if they are not accepting refugee applications? And so when you're met with as a refugee at the border, you're immediately detained and deported to possibly a third country, or back to the country that you're afraid of. Then you really have to think about the the things that we claim that we are as a country, in terms of accepting people who are in danger, or the Statue of Liberty and all the things that it stands for. Are we even really offering that thing if we don't even accept or process refugee applications, and our asylum claims are limited to 7,500 per year? Methinks that there's more than 7,500 people in this world that are suffering that may be entitled to a valid application. But I guess, who am I? Who am I to say? But those are some. And then I'm just going to go over the rest really quickly so we can just have more questions. So one big beautiful bill is a big way that that laws and everything is currently playing out in the current events. This gave a huge amount with very limited boundaries to the executive to spend on immigration forces, and the bulk of it went to border enforcement and surveillance, which is confusing because contextually, the USCIS, which is the office that processes applications, their wait times have never been longer, and the availability of staff has never been smaller. So it's confusing why it's got where all this money is going. If I work in the area, and it's just getting harder and harder to do things legally, but there's lots more money in border enforcement and surveillance and detention and ICE and all those things. So a little frustrating. And not to mention, there's been, I believe, over 100 immigration judges have been terminated immediately with no cause. One would think some of that 75 billion would maybe go to that, but instead they are, of those 100 judges, which all of which were in a different political, I think, realm than the current administration, they have been replaced with temporary military judges, who have no immigration experience, which is going to cause delay and bad law, and probably cost the country more money in the end. But those are more examples of how things are being implemented today. Some interesting policy changes that have also shifted with the new administration is there are no more sanctuaries. There was a Biden era policy where Immigration and Border Patrol couldn't enter churches, schools, and hospitals. That is no longer the case with the current administration. There are increased fees, which I've discussed. I believe now a work like a HB1 workers visa and costs an employer $100,000, whereas before it was 1,000. That's something. And then again, new fees are where there were none, like for example, for the children, for the minors who have been victims of abuse, new fees for them. And then the removal of automatic and deferred status, which I also mentioned, and the inability of people to be able to work. So yes, you can be here and yes, you can have a pending application, but you can still be deported and you can't work. And and that, well, I think you get the picture. Mm. And then this is something that I think I hear a lot when maybe me and the person I'm discussing immigration with have very conflicting ideologies is why don't people just immigrate legally? And I think it's just so important to really know some very kind of basic logical responses that one can use if they're so interested when you're met with this question in the wild. The financial barriers are real, as I've discussed. They did not exist. They did not exist in the same capacity when our some of our ancestors immigrated in the beginning of last century. There's also the lack of available pathways, which I've discussed, meaning people used to immigrate and pay a fee and would have to prove that they didn't have communicable diseases, and that was the extent of it. Then all the laws that I mentioned in the timeline started limiting and limiting who and when and how many could come. And now it's just that, but even to a higher extent. And the complexity of the application process and the forms and the policies with the forms is deliberately obfuscating and complicated. And, it's a lot more complicated. And I think it's helpful to kind of think about just picture being from another country and wanting to travel to the US. Like, how do you think that would look like? What do you think that you'd start to do and what were your options would be? And I think you'd be surprised based off some of the information that I communicated today, how limited those options are and how confusing and sometimes how they don't even exist to you. I think those are really helpful. That's a helpful perspective to kind of look at so you can kind of answer this question more broadly and more informed and more, compassionately when you come up against it. So that's a lot of information. And I like to end with this quote because I think it is relevant and I think it is true. And I think that we could be reminded of it right now as a country. So thank you so much. And now I welcome any questions or discussion. Thank you for your patience and thank you for your forgiving me for my speed of talking. I got kind of flustered at the end trying to fit everything in, so I apologize. But if there's anything that you want to discuss now, I'd be happy to stay extra and talk more slowly.
We had one question about how much is the fee now, and I think you mentioned 100,000 is the answer. Uh,
Yeah, 100,000 for a HB1 visa, which is like what the employer would have to pay to sponsor having a worker come over from overseas. The perhaps they were referring to the special juvenile immigrant status fee, which is $250, which certainly isn't a lot, but I think to a child, for example, an 8-year-old with no ability to work, it's hard. Yeah.
Another question, with the 75 billion going into ICE, I understand that some of this will go down to the local communities, mainly police departments, and they will be making local agreements without without any restrictions to racial profiling. Won't this incentivize local enforcement to make more stops, like the money that militarizes the police for traffic stops relating justified by war on drugs?
Yes.
Okay. Next question. Are there certain groups that we could support that are lobbying for better immigration laws?
Oh, what a tough question. That's a great question. Um,
If you don't
you
know,
know,
you could let us know and we could send it out later too.
Yeah, I don't know specifically, but I have worked with nonprofits in the past that have multiple purposes like what I do, actual lawyering, and then they also have a section where they do advocacy and policy lobbying. We don't have that at Immigrant Law Center. I'm sure other organizations do. I think the biggest thing you can do is, I guess, your vote. I mean, like, really voting for people who don't use xenophobia as a platform and really are pro-immigrant and pro yeah, just more open. I think that's the best. And I'll try to look into it and get back to you for sure, because that's a great question.
Next
I should
question.
know.
What documents do people need to present if they are stopped by ICE or other authorities?
That would be limited to what status they have. So it is the law that you have to carry your immigration's evidence of immigration status with you at all times. So if you have a lawful permanent resident card, you bring it with you. If you have a work permit, you carry it with you. If your card, it needs to be with you. If you don't have any of those things, if your application is pending and you're not quite there, then our attorneys, give you the receipt notices, the official receipt notices from USCIS, and that shows that you are an applicant, that your application is pending, and that that should protect you. Whether or not it will is in effect is different. But yeah, if you don't have any actual identification, then having your receipts from USCIS is helpful. If you don't have any of those things, then there's no answer to that, unfortunately.
Could you tell us the fee for SUS?
SUS.
That's
Does
what
the person want to come off mute and did
SIJS.
okay. SIJS. That's 250. Yeah, we mentioned that. Yeah.
okay. Um, just sometimes I find the importance in conversations with people who are anti-immigration is to talk about why people are attempting to immigrate. Describing what they are conditions in the countries they are leaving can sometimes get people to reconsider their opinions. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. And I also sometimes think that like should it even matter? Like I think that just kind of going back to this slide here, the lack of available pathways on the lower left, like I think it's really helpful sometimes to just like picture like where you're from. Like what if, for example, you just wanted to try, like us right now, like say you and I, like we want to go to France. Why should we have to justify whether or not we want to go to France? Like what if France was like, ugh, no thanks, not you. Like what if getting like a tourist visa was like impossible? Why? Like should we have to prove that we're suffering over here? Like why does there have to be a justification for like someone's presence in another country simply because of their nationality? It feels so gatekeepy and elitist, you know? So it's like part of me feels like that is a good way to try to get the other person to empathize if that's where they're coming from. But then the next step for me is like removing that, because I'm just like, why should that matter? Why shouldn't someone have the opportunity to be here regardless of where they were born? Why am I more entitled to this just because of the complete fluke that I was born here? I just it like all of that feels so, but I think that's maybe too loosey goosey. Maybe I'm a little bit too progressive, so that might not be the greatest place to start. But yes, I think that is an interesting way to try to find someone else to be a little bit more compassionate. Yeah, and especially maybe bring up the fact that the immigrants are significantly less likely to commit crimes, and the majority of them come here for financial purposes, meaning they want to work. So isn't that kind of like the archetypal, like measure of quality of a person in the US in a capitalist society is like what a hard worker they are. So if they're desperate to come here to work and they're doing it despite entering illegally or working illegally and they're still doing it, then isn't that almost admirable? Can't one relate to that? I don't know. Try that.
I have just two last questions here. How many immigrants have been deported so far? And is the administration on track for the number the Trump campaign claims it would deport in his tenure?
So I think because the DOJ and the Homeland Security doesn't need to provide data every day. We can't know how many people have been deported. We don't know an exact number. We can get like a basic idea of how many people are detained because, people families are left behind and want to know where they are, and attorneys are left behind wanting to know where they are. And so it's difficult to say, but no, I don't think he is on track. I think, what did he say, 3,000 a day? I mean, I think that maybe there was a point that he was doing that, but I mean, every day, I don't think so. No, I certainly hope not.
Okay, and then the last question you just touched on, is it true that ICE has a quota to deport 3,000 people a day?
Yeah, I think that he has made no mistake of touting that very publicly, and so I think that they have a, they have a, like, a de facto quota. I mean, I don't know if it means they would have any practical, like, if they'd be fired if they didn't meet that quota. I don't know if it has any real implications for them, but I think it's just a thing that he says that he wants to say, and whether, but he says a lot of things that don't actually happen. So
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And there's many comments to thank you for your presentation.
thanks. I appreciate it. I really, again, appreciate your patience and with me. I tried my best.
I'm wondering if I should put the Immigrant Law Center website on there. I will do it, in fact, right now.
Sure. Yeah, put it in the chat and you guys can come check it out. And
Yeah.
if anyone is interested in volunteering and they speak another language, it's always useful to have translation services, or if they just want to be involved in a different capacity, share with their friends, donate money, any of those things. Yeah, everything is appreciated and valued. And I still will stick around a little bit longer if anyone has any more questions. But I really appreciate your time, and I'm excited that you guys all spent your Saturday morning to be interested in something like this. I think it speaks to your compassion and curiosity and intelligence. So thank you. And I hope you guys have a lovely Saturday, enjoying the last glimpses of warm weather before we get sucked into the Antarctic for the summer, for the winter.
Thank you so much, Karina. It was absolutely so interesting. And I'm a bit overwhelmed, but even more depressed about what's going on in the world.
I know, I'm sorry. I was trying to be like neutral. I think I failed, so sorry.
But after this meeting, I will send some action to-dos that were from Kari Hong, an attorney who spoke to the League of Women Voters, Minneapolis Civic Buzz, and a League study guide that includes League's national and state positions on immigration and immigrant issues, and a link to Kari Hong's presentation to the Civic Buzz. And then in a couple of days, I'll send the link to today's recording. We want to get it on YouTube first so it doesn't disappear in 28 days like our Zoom thing
Oh,
too.
please let it.
And I
Oh, no.
apologize. I thought I had it on recording and I didn't get the very beginning, but close enough to, I think I got it. It started at the second slide, I think. But thank you. Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
And thank you to everyone who attended.